Welcome again. This is the Dartmouth Historical and Arts Society evening series, Sunday evenings at the Russell's Mills Schoolhouse. Tonight's topic is colonial and national periods of agriculture in Dartmouth, the periods 1780 to 1900. And our guest speaker is again Claude A. Ledoux, who as a youth delivered grain all over this area, including Dartmouth, and has worked as a farmer in his early days. Later on has been a selectman in the town of Westport for many years and has produced many television programs regarding the town of Westport and the people who live in it. I'm very happy to welcome Claude again to deliver this evening's talk. Thank you for coming.
Hi, I'm Claude Ledoux, Westport resident, and I want to thank Dartmouth Community TV for this opportunity to talk to you about local farming during the post-Indian, colonial, and national eras. I want to thank Derek Freitz, the coordinator for Dartmouth Public TV, and Jason Pratami, who is producing and editing this show. We will be delivering this lecture to the Dartmouth Historical and Arts Society, which Jason belongs to, or Jason is a member of, and we'll be doing that on June the 25th, 2017. Okay, now the departure from the Indian common land ownership to private properties happened after the Pilgrims and government of the colonial country started, and the colonial period was roughly from 1780 to 1830. That was followed by the national period for this country from 1830 to 1900. This is a precursor to a talk, which will be part 3, about Westport's 20th century farming, with an emphasis on the 1950s during a time of the maximum number of farms in the area. And that was somewhat spurred by the needs for food production of World War II. The industrial period, 1900 to about 1980, would be the part 3 talk, which will be covered after this sequence. The local agricultural land use during the post-Indian colonial 1650 to 1780 is part 2 of this 3-part series. The first part was Indian agriculture, which was characterized by common land ownership, and the animals that were domesticated were just dogs, and that was about it. Then we switched to private land ownership in the colonial period, with many animal species becoming part of agriculture, and that was a marked difference between the two agricultural cultures. The 1950s agriculture was at a peak level of farms until about the 1970s, and that involved a lot of meat products. Then the present agricultural stage in our local area is a minimal number of farms, seasonable vegetable and forest crops, open barns, dairy dependence on corn silage, fallow lands, grass-fed beef, sheep, goats, chicken, and a lot of new ventures in agriculture, some of them just fairly small, other ones kind of on a trial basis. All right. The colonial period farming, 1650 to 1780, was subsistence farms, low incomes, due to lack of heavy population markets in the area. Everybody was farming in essence. There were village commons which were somewhat shared saving grounds, grazing grounds rather, and shared labor. This is a new dimension and a big change from the Indian era. Here's some of the major changes. The introduction of farm animals, chickens, pigs. Pigs were good for land clearing as well as quick meat production. Sheep, clothing, goats, which were used for brush browsers, and also some milk. And the veal, oxen, horses, wild turkeys, all of those animals were not used in Indian agriculture. I have to mention that wild turkeys, in order to keep them somewhat confined, they're good flyers, so are chickens at times. One of the customs was to clip the tail of the ends of the wing feathers on one side. The animal couldn't take off that way, it would just kind of spin around. That was a common practice. It did not hurt the birds. The crops at the time were wheat, barley, rye, oats, and many other varieties of vegetables and fruits. This was a mixture of Indian and European crops with accompanying slash and burn agricultural process. It's important at this time to note that the European crops were being imported into what used to be strictly Indian crops. Grains and sawmills were used. A lot of this was driven by the fact that they had an animal culture. And this was driven by water power from many man-made earthenworks dams. There were remnants of those dams still around. They were breached in order somewhat destroyed by the state in about 1958, simultaneous with the construction of Route 88. There were many beautiful stone culverts also through the woodlands over where the brooks crossed. And the culverts some of them are still existing and very impressive. And they were used for trafficking goods from one end of town to the other, and following the meandering paths of the day. The Mouse Mill Bridge on Mouse Mill Road, by the way, was a fairly recent destruction, which was the beautiful two-barrel stone culvert, and that was destroyed because it was deemed to be not sufficient for today's water flows or traffic. Farmers produced most of their own food needs and products. They made their own furniture, they made their own clothing, soap, and household items. All New England farming was essentially similar. There were similar proportions of pasturage size, woodlands, tillage, quantity of stock animals. It was a fairly uniform type of farming, and that was kind of dictated by the lack that there was very limited markets, but farmers were mostly self-sufficient. Population conditions were a low standard of living, immigration due to family growth outpacing farmstead family limits, and unchanging social lifestyles. It was a cradle-to-grave farm life for most people, except the ones that migrated away due to overgrowing the farm abilities. So, we go on to the next slide, colonial period farming. Want to switch slides? There we go. Oh, that's one That's one too many. If you can come back one. Okay, I'm missing one, so then we'll just go ahead with the next one. There we go. The marked differences from the previous Indian cultivation were the needs to provide for animals, hay, shelter, confinement, and winter feed needs when the natural food was not available for the animals. The land needs were also different. There was a stone removal, plowing, cultivating, and a very important aspect was manure management, which all of those particular things were not required by the Indians. The work was around larger stones that could not be removed, were just left in place, and the cultivation would take care around the stones. At the time, there was enough land per square foot for the farmers, so removal of those stones was not critical. They just learned to live with them. With time progression, oxen helped to large stones removal, but machinery waited until the national period when the machinery that could handle all of this heavy work became available for a wide usage of people. Wells were used for cold food storage. Well water would typically be in a 50 to 55 degree temperature range. So by dunking some of your butter, for instance, milk, things like that, down the well, that would keep the food pretty well for a few days. Salt curing was very heavily used, and also smoking for food's preservations. One important factor to note is that dirt floor cellars of the day helped with storage of, for instance, potatoes and things of that nature, because the coolness of the ground and the natural moisture in the cellar helped to keep those crops over for a long time. Ice production was also done on the ponds that were available. A good example was in my book was that the Mouse Mill Pond that we moved to when we emigrated from Canada in 1949. It was a beautiful little pond, a couple of acres, with nice dam works and control of water. And Mouse Mill had been used for milling grain, and there was a joke about it that this grain mill was produced so little that it could only feed a few mice. But however, it was used for that purpose, and not in our day, but the remnants of it were still there. The ice house remnants are still there to this day along Mouse Mill Road. Next one. Look, an interesting fact that I've observed over the years is that if you compare the land levels on opposite sides of stone walls, where you have agricultural side that's been farmed for maybe a couple of hundred years, and the forested side that has never been farmed because of wetlands, or it just never was farmed, you'll find the level of the lands on each side of the wall is not level. It's about 1 foot to 1.5 feet higher on the fallow side, the wooded side, than it is on the cultivated side. The lower level is due, in the agricultural side, is due to the removal of stones, stumping, and repeated cultivation. And finally, an important factor today is that wetlands protection laws are sometimes used to designate the site that's wooded to be wetlands, because it's primarily red maple. So that can affect the farmland sides on the other side of the wall, because now the wetlands laws can dictate a 100-foot separation buffer zone between wetlands and the agricultural land, and sometimes that can create problems because it would limit use of the agricultural land that has been used all those years to be 100 feet away from the wall, so that can destroy quite a bit of usable farmland. That's a problem with growing along with changes in the laws. So colonial land uses, with time, evolved in response to demographic changes caused by developing industrialization. New England early industrial center, as far as I could find from the historical stuff, was in Beverly, Mass. That was the first cotton mill built in 1787. Rapid industry advancements followed, and proliferation of industrial centers occurred in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Maine. So from 1790 to 1850, non-agricultural urban population centers revolutionized the marketing of agricultural products because a big food needed to be available, large amounts of food. So while newly established railroad transportation also enabled competition from the western states, at that time, railroads were proliferating throughout the country, and they made transportation available cheap, quick, and moved heavy amounts of goods prior to transportation having been done through waterways. So the railroads started to revolutionize the proliferation of food needs and food trading. Now I'm going to give you a little brief sidestep, which is not on the slide, that local agriculture during the times we're dealing with were also accompanied by giant sugar and cotton plantations, not in our area, but they were being developed, and most of it with slave trade and slave labor. I'm only mentioning this because although it wasn't the case here, it caused countrywide and actually worldwide changes in agriculture and the movement of goods. Farmers increased the productivity of their cash crops with specialized crops. The markets needed potash, pearl ash, charcoal, fuel wood, and Connecticut tobacco, which later became a famous shade-grown tobacco, shade-grown under nets. At the beginning, the tobacco was grown in open condition, of course. This developed, all of the industrial growth developed worker shortages, and farm girls and children from 1830 to 1860 moved to growing cities for opportunities. This was followed by immigration of Irish and French Canadian workers. There are some beautiful pictures in Lee's Market going back to the 1900s and later and earlier, showing groups of immigrants at different workplaces and different posed groups. The Irish and French Canadians were later followed by Portuguese, Polish, and other immigrants. A curiosity was my digging into what the heck was pearl ash. It turned out that it's a leavening chemical, sometimes called salts of tartar, which I've heard referred to some in cooking stuff. Not that I would know about it, but people that do cook, I know about salts of tartar much of the time. It's a potassium carbonate derived from potash. And potash is defined as a potassium carbonate from wood ashes, quote, containing potassium. And it's also defined as a potassium compound used in agriculture. It's a fine white powder resulting from potash baked in a kiln. So the agricultural changes were taking place due to a countrywide competition as well as marketing in especially by growing population centers. The western states were production of pork, cattle fattening, and wheat forced the local farms to shift to more perishable products such as milk, butter, potatoes, broom corn, and broom corn was actually a worldwide way to make brooms that worked pretty well. So I saw them all over the world. I witnessed corn broom production or being used by people in Korea. Their own design, of course. So economical Western grain in large quantities shipped by railroads furnished the food supply for a very, very large local poultry farming. Just as one example, I worked with my father for a while when I was 13 or 14 years old after first immigrating here, emptying out grain cars from out west at the Dayton Railroad siding, which is still there, now abandoned and overgrown by brush. But all the grain bags were 100-pound bags, and when you opened up a big grain car, there would be maybe a few thousand of those bags in there, and we would empty that out and take it to sort out at grain shops and deliver it to farms all over the place. So when we went to the national period, which we followed the colonial period, this led ultimately to changes that created the 1950s maximum number of farms in this area and the maximum amount of agricultural production. And this helped to provide the foods and the goods of World War II. There was a giant demand for foods during that war for our own war effort, as well as feeding most of the rest of the world that was in turmoil and running out of food. So this was the 50s type of farming transitioned into the 70s changes to specialized farm methods. So I can remember that the leftover potato stock of the 50s left on many local farms, small stuff, was allowed to be picked by people from the city and people that would make good use of that food. Potatoes were a large crop until the Temec debacle of the 1970s. This was a major effect to destroy the local potato industry. It was a very hard chemical to get rid of, and most of the local farms growing potatoes went out of business at that time, with the exception of the Smith and Bone farms on Hicksbridge Road, as well as the Sampson farms off of Old Westport Road, which is still in operation. That's the only one that I know of that's still operating. So early cheap products like textiles also cut the need for handmade stuff, and working women began to earn cash incomes from other types of production than handmade clothing. So I'm going to take a little detour about close neighbors, French-Canadian immigration, as an example of immigrants. So a little bit of this, we're going to follow the the lifestyle of immigrants in a new country, and this was fairly typical of just about all other immigrants. It's not just French Canadians. About 1850 to 1900, nearly half of the French Canadian population in Canada migrated to New England, attracted by textile mills. About half of the 600,000 or so immigrants remained in the United States permanently, and you see the results in all of the local states, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and some in Connecticut. As for the Ledoux, we came in 1949, a family of 8 children, fairly typical by other people of coming from Canada. I was the oldest at 13. We followed prior Ledoux immigrants that had migrated as early as 1900. Our Canadian ancestry in Quebec province dated 13 generations back to the 1660s. And it's important to note that all of the descendants from the first Ledoux in 1668 or so lived within 100 miles of the first Ledoux original settlement, which was amazing that there was so much development of families over such a long period of time that stayed almost exactly where they were, which bespeaks of a successful farming environment to work and produce all the food for that many people for so many generations. My first full-time job here at the age of 13 was working on the local farms. I was getting $1 a day for 10 to 12 hours of work a day, and I would not have been the only one. There were other people of my age doing the same thing. We were not mistreated. We had to put in a good day's work, and most of the time you would get a noon meal with your $1 a day. It involved walking from home, wherever it was, to the farm. In my case, it was about a mile. When it was still dark in the morning, round up the cows in the summer, which would be in pasture, milk, clean the barn, and go to breakfast, and come back after breakfast, and at night, about 6 o'clock or so, walk back home. Fairly typical stuff of the day. There was a French-Canadian newspaper called L'Indépendant, owned by the Clapin family. Jean-Louis Clapin is one of our Westport neighbors presently. He's still around. This paper had a 50,000 subscribers number in 1935, so it was pretty famous. There were a lot of French-speaking people around. Again, the national period from 1790 to 1900 involved a lot of mechanization. We started having steam power and all kinds of other mechanized equipment, some very specific to certain jobs. Agriculture revolutionized farm equipment, totally unapproved by OSHA, and it worked very well. Cast iron plows by 1830 would be used countrywide. There was a remembrance of most farmers that used the plow in back of a big draft horse, that you were careful to hold the traces or the traces that held the plow and guided it carefully, because if that plow happened to hit a stone, the handles would fly up and wouldn't take your head off, but it could really hurt. So you had to kind of be stepping back and be conscious of that plow getting hung up. That would not stop the horse. You would just kind of keep trucking, and being careful of dodging the handlebars was pretty important. The mowing machines were sickle bar machines. Some of them are still in use, but they have now been replaced by rotary mowers. Horse rakes, many of those are still around. They were back dump rakes in the back, and they were used to lay up furrows of hay. And now the horse rakes, dump rakes, have grown to side delivery rakes, and now rotary type rakes that tether the hay as well as rake it up in one run. There was also another very interesting piece of machinery called a hay kicker. I've only seen the remnants of a couple in the whole area, and they were quite a machine. They had these revolving forks that would kick the hay up and fluff it up so it would dry better. And that was done in back of a horse. So you were sitting in back of the horse for a long period of time facing the rear quarter, and these things would be kicking hay all around you. You're sitting on a small seat. If you ever fell off that seat, you'd be pretty well done for. But everybody used them, and I don't know, they became obsoleted by more up-to-date equipment. If you ever get a chance to take a look at one, you'll wonder how people ever worked with it. So the moving parts of all of this equipment, the mowing machines, the rakes, the kickers, and a bunch of other stuff, they were all pretty dangerous, and you learn to be careful of those moving parts very, very quickly. An important point to bring out is Ernie Waite, one of the Westport's very long-term Yankee farmers who just died a couple of years ago, had his lower leg taken off at the age of 22 by a revolving shaft on a boat that he was going on a Sunday pleasure ride with. Very interesting story. Ernie is shown in 3 of the Westport Matters videos that are available on Westport History website. The technology of tractors and specialized tools like potato harvesters and corn harvesters also revolutionized the gathering of crop materials and made it possible to get out of a hands-on to each particular corn cob or section of hay, to moving large equipment, large amounts of this stuff being spit out by machinery that's designed to do it. Some of the result of all this, of course, would be fairly obvious, because all the corn choppers that became very efficient were used for increased silage use. Silage use is one way to store large amounts of food in a small volume and produces much more milk, with the result that dairy herds today use almost no hay at all. The increasing farm products and farm equipment sales generated many off-farm businesses and employment. You can think of Ted's Farm Equipment in Fairhaven, for instance, Goldstein's Farm Equipment in Westport, and a whole slew of people that catered to repairing and selling and trading farm equipment. So by the early 1900s, farm evolution was self-sustaining farmsteads centered on loose hay, manure cellars. Those were standard barns, loose hay, manure cellar barns. Very few of them still remain. And these farms had a self-sufficient food supply of beef, pork, chickens, milks, eggs, fruits, and vegetables. Farmers never had to buy much food of any type except maybe sugar and flour and things of that nature. The manure cellar barn necessitated backing the conveyor of manure, in the case of the 1950s, a manure spreader into the manure cellar under the barn, where manure had accumulated throughout the winter, and You put it in a spreader for purpose of getting it on the fields before the crops would start to be planted and the field plowed. It involved standing in the manure maybe up to 2 or 3 feet deep, most of the time with hip boots, and shoveling this manure into the spreader all day long. The methane generated was enough to make you dizzy, and a couple of days of that kind of work was pretty sobering stuff. After that experience, no job was ever too hard. So, continuing on with the food supply, preservation of food changed greatly from purely salting and smoking to preservation in glass jars, and that usually ensured very nourishing, long-lasting storage. The women would be occupied in the fall for a long period of time just preparing the food for storage, even including meats, and these jars would be stored mostly under the cellar steps and gotten throughout the year, and the food was very wholesome and very nourishing, and it was a darn good way to do it. So following all of this local farming self-sufficiency, the increased city populations also drastically demanded products of milk products, and since a lot of the other meat stuff was coming from out west, the local dairy farming increased tremendously to answer the need for milk products. And other farms, such as chicken farms, also grew tremendously. So with incomes from milk and other farm products, local farms supported about 2 households in a birth-to-death life cycle as a rule. It was a good life, and this type of farming peaked during the 1950s in our local area and throughout much of New England. Before the next slide, and we can leave that one on, I just want to make a note that a lot of this information, much more detail, is available if you Google Wikipedia or just Google industrial area New England for information, and it just comes at you faster than you can assimilate it. So I'm going to go back to the U.S. food production importance. One of the important factors that jumps at you is that this country, during the Second War, I happened to live through it as a youngster from 30 to 35, 1935, and as a young, fairly grown up, lower than teenage years, very conscious of the war effort because you heard about it, you could see the effects of it, you lived through it, the rationing of food, the grown-ups discussing it. So you became very aware, in the news that you got over the radio, when the parents took time at night to sit down and listen to the shortwave broadcasts, included the importance of this country saving the rest of the world, which you don't get to comprehend until later when you read more history and realize what happened during those years. The very brutal and big dictatorships exist all over the world. This country saved the world, and it also fed the world. Those are facts that you can't deny, and that happened during World War II. And that the reason for our farming being so important at that time, wall-to-wall, fence-to-fence production, was to produce food needs of this country, our troops, and all the rest, and essentially most of the rest of the world. So foods in concert with U.S. industry, dedication and ingenuity saved the whole world from disastrous dictatorship's dominance. That's an important point to make, because along with that, food production made all the difference in the world. It wasn't just industry, it was also food producing. So all of this continued after World War II with the later defeat of a very brutal Stalinist dictatorship that slaughtered, as far as people can figure, 22 million of its own people, and enslaved most of its independent neighbors. Important point to make, because it relates to our lifetime as well as the lifetimes of many others. So I want to thank you, Claude Ledoux. Next one. Oh, I'm sorry. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for straightening out my files, Jason. The present period, the present agricultural stage in our area and in quite a bit of the country actually, is a very minimal number of farms compared to what there used to be. The farm population in reference to the total country is a very low percentage. In the local area, we see seasonal vegetable and forest cropping. I do forest crops myself. We see open barns, corn silage dependence, especially for dairy. And we see fallow lands. When we see the new ventures, grass-fed beef, sheep, goats, and chickens. Weatherlow Farms on Sodom Road in Westport is notable, and if you go to their website, Weatherlow Farms, you can Google it. You'll see how such new ventures are progressing. Now, we can give Claude Ledoux thank you, and I want to make a special note that I'm a French Canuck legal immigrant of 82 years old. And finally, the last slide shows some of the enjoyable stuff that I can still enjoy. Not as much as I used to. I don't get done as much as I used to, but I can still enjoy doing this stuff, and I think I'm very fortunate to have been able to live through all of those decades and learn about agriculture and be able to participate in some parts of it. So thank you, and I want to thank Community TV and Dartmouth for recording this and making it available. Thanks a lot.